It was -20 degrees in upstate New York when Bella opened her cabin door to find a man bleeding out in the freezing snow. She didn't know he was a ghost, the ruthless, untouchable head of the Romano syndicate. She just saw a dying man in a ruined Brioni suit. But no good deed goes unpunished. Because 12 hours later, Bella didn't wake up to the peaceful sound of winter birds. She woke up to the deafening, earth-shaking roar of engines, looking out her window to find 500 blacked-out SUVs forming an impenetrable steel wall around her home. January 14th, 2024. The National Weather Service had issued a catastrophic blizzard warning for the Adirondack Mountains, predicting whiteout conditions and temperatures plunging low enough to snap exposed power lines. Bella Hayes, a 32-year-old trauma nurse who had recently taken an extended leave from Champlain Valley Medical Center, was exactly where she wanted to be. Entirely alone. Her grandfather's isolated log cabin sat at the end of a heavily wooded 5-mile dirt road, far from the nearest town. It was her sanctuary from a grueling career and a world she was desperately trying to mute. By 11 p.m., the storm was a howling monster. Bella was sitting by the cast-iron wood stove, wrapped in a heavy Pendleton blanket, reading a paperback by the light of a kerosene lamp. The power had been dead for hours. Then came the sound. It wasn't the wind. It was a heavy, distinct thud against the thick oak of her front door, followed by a faint, metallic scraping. Bella froze. She reached for the heavy iron fire poker resting against the hearth. Her nearest neighbor was 10 miles away, and no sane person would be driving in this weather. Heart hammering against her ribs, she crept to the door. "Hello?" she called out. The only answer was the shrieking wind. Bracing herself, Bella threw the deadbolt and pulled the door inward. The wind immediately blasted into the room, bringing a cloud of stinging snow with it. But her eyes immediately dropped to the wooden porch. A man was collapsed against the doorframe. He was entirely motionless, half buried under a fresh drift of snow. Bella's instincts as a trauma nurse instantly overrode her fear. She dropped the fire poker and dropped to her knees. The man was massive, easily over 6'2" and heavy with muscle. But what caught her attention wasn't his size. It was his clothes. He wasn't wearing a Carhartt jacket or North Face snow gear. He was wearing a shredded, custom-tailored charcoal wool overcoat over a ruined white dress shirt, and the snow beneath him wasn't just white. In the glow of her kerosene lamp, it was stained a deep, stark crimson. "Hey, can you hear me?" Bella shouted over the wind, grabbing his shoulder. He groaned, a wet, rattling sound. He was freezing to death and he was bleeding out. Bella grabbed him by the lapels of his coat, planting her boots against the doorframe for leverage. "Come on," she grunted, her muscles burning as she hauled his dead weight over the threshold. He slid across the hardwood floor, leaving a thick smear of blood in his wake. Bella slammed the door shut against the blizzard, throwing the deadbolt and leaning against it, gasping for air. In the quiet of the cabin, she finally got a good look at him. He had sharp, aristocratic features, a jawline shaded with dark stubble, and pitch-black hair matted to his forehead. His skin was the color of old marble, a terrifying sign of advanced hypothermia. But it was the damage to his body that sent Bella sprinting to the bathroom for her trauma bag. His coat was torn open. Beneath the expensive fabric, he was wearing a sleek, low-profile Kevlar vest. But the vest had failed him. 2 bullet holes marred the fabric, one high on his right shoulder, shattering the collarbone, and another lower down, grazing his ribs and tearing through flesh. He wasn't a lost hiker. He was a man who had been hunted, and the hunters might still be out there. Bella didn't have a sterile operating room, but she had spent 7 years in one of the busiest emergency rooms in the state. She dragged him closer to the blazing wood stove, the heat radiating against his freezing skin. With a pair of trauma shears from her med bag, she cut away the ruined Brioni coat, the Kevlar vest, and the blood-soaked dress shirt. A heavy, matte black Glock 19 clattered onto the floorboards from a concealed shoulder holster. Bella kicked it away, her focus entirely on his wounds. "Stay with me," she muttered, checking his pulse. It was thready, barely there. His core temperature was dangerously low. She poured a generous splash of rubbing alcohol over her hands, snapped on a pair of blue nitrile gloves, and went to work. The shoulder wound was a through and through, but the bleeding was severe. The rib graze was messy but superficial. She packed the shoulder wound with quick-clot combat gauze, applying brutal, direct pressure. Suddenly, the man's eyes snapped open. They were a piercing, cold steel grey, and in an instant they went from vacant to lethal. Before Bella could react, his left hand shot out like a viper, his large fingers clamping around her throat with terrifying strength. Bella gasped, her hands instinctively grabbing his wrist. "Stop!" she choked out, looking dead into his eyes. "I'm fixing your shoulder. You're bleeding to death." For a second, the man just stared at her, assessing the room, the fire, the medical gear, and finally, the woman whose life he held in his hand. He looked down at her hands, still pressing the bloody gauze into his chest. Slowly, his grip loosened. His hand fell back to the floor. "Where?" His voice was gravelly, barely a whisper. "Adirondacks," Bella said, coughing as she rubbed her neck. "You're in my cabin. You collapsed on my porch. Who shot you?" He didn't answer. His eyes fluttered, the pain and the cold dragging him back under. "Don't call the cops," he managed to breathe out. "If you do, they'll kill you too." Before she could ask who they were, his eyes rolled back, and he lost consciousness again. Bella stared at the man for a long moment. Common sense screamed at her to hike to her truck, turn on the satellite radio, and call the state troopers. But the storm outside was impassable, and he was right. If professional hitmen were looking for him, a local sheriff's deputy showing up would just be collateral damage. She finished dressing his wounds, securing the bandages tightly. She noticed a heavy Patek Philippe Nautilus watch on his left wrist. The sapphire crystal cracked, but the intricate mechanical dials still ticking perfectly. This man wasn't a street thug. He was high level. For the next 6 hours, Bella fought a war against the cold. She piled every wool blanket and sleeping bag she owned on top of him. She kept the fire roaring, feeding it heavy logs of white oak until the cabin was sweltering. She sat beside him on the floor, continually checking his pulse and wiping the sweat from his brow as his body violently shivered, slowly fighting its way back to a normal temperature. Exhausted, covered in his blood, Bella finally slumped against the base of her armchair, the fire poker resting across her lap. She drifted into a restless, paranoid sleep. Bella woke with a start. The fire had burned down to glowing red embers. The cabin was quiet. She blinked, disoriented, her neck stiff from sleeping on the floor. The grey light of dawn was filtering through the frost-covered windows. The blizzard had finally broken. She immediately looked toward the makeshift bed on the floor. The blankets were thrown back. He was gone. Bella scrambled to her feet, her heart leaping into her throat. She spun around, her eyes darting across the small cabin. He was standing by the kitchen window. He had managed to find a heavy flannel shirt of her grandfather's, wearing it unbuttoned over his bandaged chest. He was leaning heavily against the counter, staring out at the snow-covered driveway. The Glock she had kicked away the night before was gripped casually in his right hand. "You shouldn't be standing," Bella said, her voice tight. He didn't turn around. "You saved my life," he said. His voice was stronger now, a deep, commanding baritone that filled the small space. "You're Bella." Bella frowned. "How do you know my name?" "I read the mail on your table," he replied calmly. "My name is Silas." Silas. The name didn't mean anything to her, but the way he said it implied it should. Before Bella could tell him to put the gun down, a sound broke the silence. It started as a low vibration, a hum that Bella felt in the soles of her feet before she actually heard it. The floorboards trembled. The ceramic mugs hanging on the kitchen rack began to clink together. "What is that?" Bella asked, moving toward the window. "Is that a snowplow?" "No," Silas said, his jaw tightening. He racked the slide of the Glock, chambering around. "That's my problem catching up with me." Bella reached the window and wiped away a circle of frost. Her breath hitched in her throat. It wasn't a snowplow. It was an armada. Cresting the hill of her private, unplowed 5-mile driveway was a convoy of vehicles, unlike anything she had ever seen. Massive, blacked-out Chevrolet Suburbans, Mercedes G-Wagons, and armored Ford Excursions were plowing through 3 feet of snow with brutal efficiency. It wasn't just 5 or 10 cars. They were pouring out of the tree line in a seemingly endless stream. 50, 100, 200. The line of black steel stretched all the way back to the main highway, completely swallowing her property. The sheer logistics of it were staggering. They formed a massive, organized ring around her tiny cabin, their headlights cutting through the morning fog like predatory eyes. 500 SUVs, idling in unison. The sound was a deafening, mechanical roar that vibrated the glass in the window panes. Bella stumbled backward, terrified. "Who are you?" she whispered, looking at Silas. "Are they here to finish the job?" Silas looked out at the sea of vehicles, his expression unreadable. "No," he said softly. "They're not here to kill me, Bella." He turned to her, his cold grey eyes softening just a fraction. "They're here because they realized their boss was missing." Suddenly, the doors of the lead vehicles swung open simultaneously. Hundreds of men in dark winter coats stepped out into the freezing snow, their hands resting on their holstered weapons, their eyes fixed directly on Bella's front door. The silence that followed the arrival of the motorcade was heavier than the roar of the engines. Outside Bella's frost-rimmed window, the army of men stood frozen in the knee-deep snow, a battalion of dark wool and tailored Italian cashmere against the blinding white of the Adirondack morning. Silas lowered the Glock. He didn't drop it, but the lethal tension bled out of his shoulders. He unbolted the heavy oak door and pulled it open, the frigid air rushing into the sweltering cabin. Bella stood frozen by the kitchen island, her hands gripping the edge of the counter so tightly her knuckles were white. From the center of the armada, a man broke ranks. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a midnight blue Tom Ford overcoat. He trudged up the porch steps, his eyes scanning the blood-stained floorboards before settling on Silas. He stopped 3 feet away, bowing his head slightly in a gesture of absolute, unquestioning deference. "Boss?" the man said, his voice thick with a Boston accent. "We tore apart half the state looking for you. When the tracker in your watch went dark on Route 73, we thought the Kozlovs had dumped you in the Saranac River." "They tried, Dominic," Silas replied, his voice raspy but authoritative. "They hit the Cadillac with armor-piercing rounds. Driver was killed instantly. I bailed into the tree line and walked until I found this place." Dominic's eyes shifted to Bella. His hand rested casually near the lapel of his coat, where the grip of a Sig Sauer P320 was undoubtedly hidden. "And the girl?" "She's the reason I still have a pulse," Silas said. The words were a command, an absolute debellation of her protected status. She's a trauma nurse. She dug a 9mm hollow point out of my shoulder and stabilized the bleeding. Dominic nodded, his demeanor instantly shifting from suspicious to respectful. We have a medevac chopper on standby at the Lake Placid airfield. Dr. Sterling is prepping the private surgical suite at the Meadow Lane estate. We need to move you, boss. Now. The Kozlov Bratva knows you survived the ambush. They are hunting. I'm ready, Silas said. He turned to Bella, the coldness in his eyes melting into something dangerously close to warmth. Get your coat, Bella. Bella blinked, her brain struggling to process the command. What? No, I'm not going anywhere. You have your army. You're safe. I'm staying in my cabin. Silas took a slow, painful step toward her. The sheer physical presence of the man was overwhelming. Bella, you pulled a bullet out of the head of the Romano syndicate. You saw my face. You know I was here. The men who hit me aren't street thugs. They are a highly organized Russian paramilitary outfit. By tonight, they will track my blood trail through the snow, right to this door. If you stay here, you are dead. I'll call the police, Bella shot back, her voice shaking but defiant. I'll tell them I was taken hostage. The local sheriff makes $40,000 a year, Dominic interjected dryly. The Kozlovs will hand him a duffel bag with $500,000 in unmarked hundreds to look the other way, while they burn this cabin to the ash with you inside. You don't have a choice, Mom. Bella looked at the blood on her floor, the shattered Kevlar vest, and the 500 SUVs idling in her yard. Her quiet sanctuary had been utterly destroyed. 10 minutes, she whispered, her throat tight. Let me pack a bag. Silas nodded. Dominic, put a 10-man perimeter around the house while she packs. Nobody gets within a mile of this ridge. The extraction was a masterclass in tactical logistics. Bella was placed in the back of a heavily armored Mercedes-Benz Maybach SUV, sandwiched between two Suburbans equipped with military-grade communication jammers. Silas was beside her, hooked up to an IV of lactated Ringer's solution that Dominic had brought from their medical cache. 3 hours later, the motorcade passed through a pair of 20-foot wrought-iron gates in Southampton, Long Island. The Meadow Lane estate was a fortress, disguised as a $60 million architectural masterpiece. Overlooking the Atlantic Ocean, the property was surrounded by reinforced concrete walls, biometric security checkpoints, and armed patrols walking the perimeter with Belgian Malinois guard dogs. Bella was escorted into a massive, sunlit foyer paved in Calcutta marble. Despite the terrifying circumstances, she couldn't help but be struck by the sheer, staggering wealth of the Romano syndicate. Dr. Harrison Sterling, a brilliant but disgraced former chief of surgery at Mount Sinai, was waiting in the estate's underground medical wing. It looked better equipped than most urban ICRs. Bella stood awkwardly in the corner as Sterling examined her handiwork. The packing is flawless, Dr. Sterling noted, shining a penlight into Silas's eyes to check his pupillary response. And the sutures on the rib graze are incredibly tight. You did this in a cabin with no power, Miss Hayes. By the light of a kerosene lamp, Silas answered for her, never taking his eyes off Bella. She bought you the time you needed, Mr. Romano, but I need to debride the shoulder wound and prescribe a heavy course of IV antibiotics. We can't risk sepsis. Over the next 3 days, Bella found herself existing in a bizarre gilded purgatory. She was given a sprawling guest suite with a balcony overlooking the churning grey ocean. Her closet had been stocked with thousands of dollars worth of Loro Piana sweaters, silk loungewear, and tailored winter coats in her exact size, a detail that both impressed and deeply unsettled her. She was a prisoner, but she was treated like royalty. On the 4th evening, Bella grew restless. The cabin fever was setting in. She wandered down to the estate's massive library, a room smelling of aged paper, leather, and expensive bourbon. Silas was sitting in a high-backed Chesterfield armchair by a roaring fireplace. His left arm was in a black sling, but his colour had returned. He looked less like a dying refugee and more like the ruthless billionaire kingpin he was. He was reading a leather-bound copy of Dante's Inferno, a crystal glass of Macallan, 25, resting on the side table. "You're awake late," he noted, not looking up from the pages. "It's hard to sleep when you're waiting to be assassinated by the Russian Mafia," Bella replied, wrapping her cashmere shawl tighter around her shoulders. She sat on the sofa opposite him. Silas finally looked up, closing the book. "You are safer in this house than the president is in the Oval Office, Bella. I give you my word. No one will ever touch you. Your word?" Bella let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Your word is written in blood, Silas. I spent 7 years patching up gangbangers and innocent bystanders in the ER. I know your world. It consumes everything it touches. I just wanted to be left alone." Silas's jaw tightened. "I didn't ask to collapse on your porch. But I did. Fate, God, whatever you want to call it. It tied us together." He leaned forward, the firelight catching the sharp planes of his face. "I owe you my life. In my world, a debt of that magnitude is sacred. You aren't my prisoner, Bella. You are my responsibility." "And when will I no longer be your responsibility?" she challenged. "When can I go home?" Silas stared at her for a long, heavy moment. The silence crackled with an unspoken tension that made Bella's breath catch. "When the men who tried to take my life are no longer breathing," Silas said quietly, "and not a second sooner." The illusion of absolute safety shattered less than 48 hours later. It was 2 a.m. Bella, unable to sleep, had slipped down to the medical wing to grab a bottle of water from the staff fridge. Dr. Sterling had gone home to his own estate for the night, leaving a trusted syndicate medic to monitor Silas, who was still receiving nightly IV antibiotics for the shoulder infection. As Bella walked silently down the sterile white hallway, she noticed the medic, a young guy named Paulie, slumped over the nurse's station desk, snoring heavily. Beside him was a half-empty cup of coffee. Frowning, Bella walked past him toward Silas's private recovery suite. The door was cracked open. Inside, Silas was asleep, the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor filling the dimly lit room. Above his bed, a fresh IV bag was suspended from a metal pole, the clear liquid dripping steadily down the line into a vein in his uninjured right arm. Bella stepped closer, her clinical instincts taking over. She glanced at the IV bag to check the label. It was marked cefazolin, a standard antibiotic. But something was wrong. The liquid inside the bag wasn't perfectly clear. It had a faint, almost imperceptible milky cloudiness to it. Bella's blood ran cold. Cefazolin mixed with standard saline should be crystal clear. Cloudiness meant a precipitate had formed, usually because another, incompatible drug had been injected into the bag. She leaned in, inspecting the injection port at the bottom of the bag. There, barely visible under the dim lights, was a tiny, fresh puncture mark in the rubber seal. Someone had pushed a secondary drug into his IV line. Panic surged through her. She looked at the heart monitor. Silas's heart rate was dropping. 60 beats per minute. 55. 50. "Silas," Bella hissed, grabbing his shoulder and shaking him. He didn't stir. His breathing was becoming dangerously shallow. Propofol, or a massive overdose of fentanyl, a respiratory depressant designed to stop his heart while he slept, making it look like a tragic medical complication. Bella didn't hesitate. She grabbed the plastic IV line and clamped it shut with her bare hands, stopping the flow of the tainted fluid. She yanked the needle out of his arm, tossing the line aside. "Silas, wake up!" she yelled, slapping his face hard. His eyes flew open, wide and disoriented. He gasped for air, his chest heaving, as the residual drug fought against his nervous system. The sudden shout woke Paulie at the nurse's station. He came running in, his hand on his holster. "What happened? What are you doing? Someone spiked his IV!" Bella screamed, pointing at the bag. "He was going into respiratory arrest. Where is Dominic?" Silas struggled to sit up, coughing violently, his grey eyes blazing with a sudden, terrifying realization. He looked at the cloudy IV bag, then at Paulie, who was suddenly looking very pale and very nervous. "Paulie," Silas croaked, his voice laced with pure venom. "Who was in this room?" Nobody, boss. I swear. I just made a coffee." Paulie stammered, backing away. "You drank coffee laced with a sedative so you'd pass out," Bella said, her medical mind connecting the dots. "It was an inside job." Within 60 seconds, the entire estate was locked down. The blare of a security siren cut through the night. Dominic burst into the room, fully armed, flanked by 4 massive enforcers. Silas pushed himself out of the bed, ignoring the agony in his shoulder. He stood in his sweatpants, bare-chested, the bandages stark white against his skin. The vulnerability was entirely gone, replaced by the chilling aura of a predator who had just found a snake in his den. "Dominic," Silas ordered, his voice echoing off the sterile walls. "Seal the estate. No one gets in. No one gets out. Find out who prepared that IV bag." He turned his gaze to Bella, who was shaking with adrenaline. For the second time in a week, she had pulled him back from the edge of the grave. "And Dominic?" Silas added, his eyes locked on Bella's. "Yeah, boss?" "Put a permanent detail on Bella. 2 men, 24/7. If she gets so much as a paper cut, I will bury you all under this house." The war wasn't just outside the gates anymore. It was inside the wall, the Meadow Lane estate, transformed from a luxurious sanctuary into a heavily armed bunker in less than 10 minutes. The ambient lighting was cut, replaced by the harsh, red glow of emergency tactical lights. Bella sat in the corner of Silas's suite, wrapped in a heavy Loro Piana cashmere blanket, watching as the underworld stripped away its polished veneer. Dominic dragged Dr. Harrison Sterling into the room. The brilliant, disgraced Mount Sinai surgeon was trembling. His custom Brooks Brothers suit wrinkled, his face devoid of color. 2 of Dominic's enforcers stood behind him, their expressions carved from stone. Silas sat on the edge of the medical bed. He had pulled on a fresh black t-shirt, though his left arm remained tightly bound in the sling. The cefazolin and the residual sedative had left him pale, but his eyes were entirely lucid and terrifyingly cold. "I trusted you, Harrison," Silas said, his voice a low, lethal murmur that barely carried over the sound of the ocean wind battering the reinforced windows. "I pulled you out of that malpractice lawsuit in Manhattan. I bought your debt. I gave you a private lab. And you put a lethal dose of potassium chloride and propofol into my vein." "Silas, please!" Sterling choked out, falling to his knees. "I didn't have a choice. It was Vincente and the Russians." Bella watched, her heart pounding against her ribs. Vincente Rossi. She had heard the enforcers whispering that name in the hallways. He was Silas's most trusted capo, the man running the ports in Newark. "Vincente," Silas repeated, the name tasting like ash. "My own underboss." "He came to me yesterday," Sterling pleaded, tears spilling over his cheeks. He said the Kozlovs were offering him control of the entire East Coast distribution if he handed over the syndicate. "They took my daughter, Silas. They snatched Chloe from her dorm at Columbia University. Vincente said, "If I didn't make your death look like a medical failure tonight, they would send her to me in pieces." Dominic stepped forward, his hand resting on the Heckler & Koch MP5 slung across his chest. "Give me the word, boss. I'll take his head off right now." Bella gasped, standing up involuntarily. "No! Silas, they have his daughter. He was forced." Silas raised a hand, silencing Dominic. He looked at Bella, then down at the weeping doctor. In the Mafia, treason was an absolute. There were no mitigating circumstances, but Silas also knew that without Bella's intervention, he would be dead, and Vincente would be sitting on his throne. "Lock him in the wine cellar," Silas ordered Dominic. "If we survive the night, we'll find his daughter. If we don't, it won't matter." "Survive the night?" Bella asked, her voice trembling. Silas stood up, grabbing a Sig Sauer P226 from the bedside table and checking the magazine. "Vincente knows the layout of this estate. He knows the blind spots in the security grid. If he ordered Harrison to kill me silently, it means he has a backup plan in case it failed." Before he could finish his sentence, a massive explosion rocked the foundation of the house. The sound was deafening, a concussive shock wave that shattered the reinforced glass of the balcony doors. The backup plan had arrived. The alarms didn't just ring, they shrieked, a dual-toned, oscillating siren that vibrated deep in the marrow of Bella's bones. Simultaneously, the ambient, soft-glow lighting of the Meadow Lane estate snapped off, instantly replaced by the harsh, bloody glare of red emergency tactical lights. Above them, the heavy, motorized grind of 2-inch-thick titanium shutters sliding down to seal the ocean-facing windows sounded like a bank vault locking shut. Over the tactical radio strapped tightly across Dominic's chest, a panicked voice broke through the static, completely breathless. "Front gate is breached. I repeat, main perimeter is compromised. They used a shaped C4 charge on the reinforced steel. We have multiple hostiles pouring into the courtyard. Heavy armor, automatic weapons, thermal optics. It's the Kozlovs. They're pushing the main house. They're moving too fast for a blind assault," Dominic growled, his thick fingers expertly racking the bolt of his Heckler & Koch MP5. He checked the chamber, his jaw set like granite. "Boss, we need to get you to the panic room in the sub-basement. It's rated for a direct mortar strike. We lock down. Wait for the state troopers and our city reinforcements to flank them." "No," Silas replied. His voice was deathly calm, a chilling contrast to the chaos erupting around them. He walked over to the bank of security monitors mounted on the far wall. Half the screens were already static, the cameras shot out by the advancing hit squad. On the remaining feeds, dozens of armed men in white and grey winter tactical gear were swarming the manicured lawns, trading heavy, suppressed gunfire with the syndicate's outer security detail. "Look at their vectors," Silas said, pointing to a feed showing the East Garden. "They aren't fanning out. They are moving in a direct, concentrated wedge straight toward the blind spots in our camera grid." Vincente gave them the architectural blueprints. He helped them bypass the outer biometric sensors. If we go to the panic room, we are walking into a concrete coffin. Vincente knows the ventilation access points. They'll just drop thermite down the shafts and cook us alive. Silas turned away from the monitors, his steely grey eyes locking onto Bella. The ruthless, untouchable Mafia boss who had been reading Dante by the fire was gone. In his place stood a hardened soldier, calculating acceptable losses. "Bella, listen to me very carefully," Silas said, closing the distance between them. He ignored the wince of pain that flashed across his face as his infected shoulder shifted in its sling. "Dominic is going to take you to the subterranean garage. In Bay 4, there is a matte black Audi RS6. It's armored to B7 ballistic standards. It will stop armor-piercing rifle rounds. You get in, you drive through the service exit, and you don't take your foot off the gas until you reach the safe house on Franklin Street in Tribeca. "I am not leaving you here," Bella yelled, the sheer volume of her voice surprising even herself. The muffled, heavy thud, thud, thud of automatic gunfire was already echoing from the first floor, vibrating up through the floorboards. "You have one good arm, a raging staph infection, and a sedative still metabolizing in your bloodstream. If you stay up here, you are going to die." "I will die knowing you are safe," Silas countered, his right hand gripping her shoulder with bruising intensity. "You pulled a bullet out of me in a freezing cabin. I will not let you bleed out on my floor, because my underboss is a traitor. You go. Now." Before Bella could form another protest, the heavy, solid oak door to the master suite splintered inward in a shower of wood shards and twisted hinges. Two Russian mercenaries, their faces obscured by ballistic masks and night vision goggles, stepped through the frame. Their AK-103 assault rifles were already raised, laser sights cutting through the red emergency lights. Silas didn't hesitate, and he didn't flinch. With terrifying, predatory speed, he raised the heavy Sig Sauer P226 in his right hand. He didn't aim down the sights. It was pure, violent muscle memory. Crack, crack. Two deafening gunshots filled the confined space, leaving Bella's ears ringing violently. Both mercenaries dropped like stones, their body armor useless against the perfectly placed rounds that found the unarmored gaps at their throats. The sharp, acrid smell of gunpowder and copper instantly flooded the room. "Move!" Silas roared, the command absolute. Dominic grabbed Bella's arm, practically lifting her off her feet as he dragged her toward the private service elevator, hidden behind a fake bookshelf. "Come on, Doc. Do what the boss says." Bella stumbled into the elevator, just as Dominic slammed his fist onto the sub-basement button. The doors slid shut, cutting off the sight of Silas, standing over the dead men, waiting for the rest of the assault team. The descent felt like an eternity. The elevator car shook as another massive explosion rocked the foundation of the estate above them. Bella's heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked at Dominic, who was frantically checking his spare magazines, his breathing heavy but controlled. Ding! The elevator doors opened into the massive, echoing expanse of the subterranean garage. It smelled of high-octane fuel and cold concrete. Row upon row of luxury vehicles, vintage Ferraris, sleek Lamborghinis, and heavy SUVs sat in the dim emergency lighting. Outside the high, reinforced glass windows near the ceiling, a black Sikorsky helicopter roared overhead, its massive spotlight sweeping across the grounds, casting long, frantic shadows across the garage floor. "Bay 4, straight ahead," Dominic barked, pointing his MP5 forward as he stepped out of the elevator. "Keep your head down." They sprinted past a row of concrete pillars. The matte black Audi RS6 sat waiting, heavy and menacing. But as they closed the distance, the main roll-up doors of the garage suddenly blew completely off their tracks with a deafening screech of tearing metal. 3 men stepped through the smoke and debris. They weren't wearing Kozlov winter gear. They were wearing tailored black suits over Kevlar, Vincente's rogue enforcers. They had come to block the escape route. They spotted Dominic instantly. "Contact!" Dominic yelled, shoving Bella violently behind a massive, concrete load-bearing pillar. He stepped out, laying down a punishing wall of suppressing fire with the MP5. The deafening roar of the 9mm rounds echoing off the concrete walls was physically painful. The 3 enforcers dove behind a low-slung silver Porsche, returning fire with heavier, higher-caliber rifles. Sparks rained down as bullets chewed the concrete pillar inches from Bella's face. She covered her ears, squeezing her eyes shut. Suddenly, The firing stopped, replaced by a sharp, guttural grunt. Bella opened her eyes. Dominic had collapsed to one knee. A 5.56 rifle round had punched clean through his right thigh. Blood was already pooling rapidly on the polished concrete floor. Bella's clinical brain instantly engaged. Bright red, fast flow, but not spurting. Missed the femoral artery, but he's losing volume fast. Dominic's MP5 clattered to the floor, empty. He reached frantically for his sidearm, but his hands were slick with his own blood. From behind the shattered Porsche, one of Vincente's men stood up. He racked the pump of a Benelli M4 tactical shotgun, a cruel, triumphant smile crossing his face as he walked slowly toward where Dominic was bleeding out. He didn't even see Bella trembling in the shadows. Bella couldn't just watch a man be executed. She couldn't be a bystander anymore. Her eyes darted around the dim space and locked onto a heavy, red snap-on mechanics cart, a few feet to her left. Resting on top was a massive, solid steel lug wrench. With a surge of pure, desperate adrenaline, Bella lunged from behind the pillar. She grabbed the cold steel of the wrench with both hands, the weight of it anchoring her. She didn't scream. She didn't hesitate. She swung it like a baseball bat, with every ounce of leverage she could generate. The heavy steel connected directly with the side of the enforcer's head, right at the temple, just below the rim of his helmet. The sickening crunch of bone echoed through the garage. The man's eyes rolled back instantly, the shotgun discharging harmlessly into the ceiling as his body went entirely limp, collapsing into a heap of Kevlar and broken bone. Bella stood over him, gasping for air, her hands shaking violently as she dropped the bloody wrench. The sheer, visceral reality of the violence hit her like a physical blow. Dominic looked up at her, his face pale from blood loss, his jaw practically on the floor. Holy! Before the other two enforcers could realize what had happened to their point man, the heavy metal door leading from the main house stairwell was kicked entirely off its hinges. Silas stood in the doorway. He looked like something dragged out of a nightmare. He was covered in white plaster dust and soot. Blood, none of it his own, splattered the front of his black t-shirt. He was leaning heavily against the doorframe, his chest heaving, clearly pushed to the absolute limits of human endurance. But his eyes burned with an unadulterated, biblical fury. He saw Bella standing over the unconscious man. He saw Dominic bleeding on the floor. He didn't say a single word. Silas just raised the Sig Sauer, his hand completely steady despite his exhaustion, and emptied the remainder of the magazine. He cleared the rest of the room with terrifying, mechanical precision, leaving only the sound of empty brass casings chiming against the cold concrete floor. Dawn broke over the Atlantic Ocean, not with a gentle morning glow, but with a harsh, bruising palette of purple and blood-orange light that perfectly mirrored the devastation of the Meadow Lane estate. The relentless, crashing rhythm of the ocean waves against the seawall below was now competing with the wail of distant sirens and the rhythmic, thumping rotation of the syndicate's private medical helicopters touching down on the ruined South Lawn. The siege of Southampton was over. The Kozlov hit squad had been entirely decimated, their heavy armor and thermal optics no match for a family fighting with its back against the wall on its own fortified ground. Bella sat on the heavy steel rear bumper of a private, unmarked ambulance that had been called in by the syndicate's clandestine dispatch. She was entirely covered in a mixture of white plaster dust, engine grease, and dried blood. Her $1,000 Loro Piana cashmere sweater was ruined beyond recognition, torn at the hem and stained crimson. She held a styrofoam cup of black coffee between her hands, staring blankly down at her knuckles. They were still shaking. She had spent the last 3 hours doing exactly what she had trained to do in the chaotic emergency rooms of upstate New York. She had become the eye of the storm, She had packed gunshot wounds, applied combat tourniquets, and stabilized Dominic's shattered thigh while the estate was still smoking. She had acted as a battlefield surgeon for an army of criminals, moving from man to man with a cold, detached clinical precision that had left the surviving guards staring at her in quiet awe. "Doc!" A rough voice groaned from the stretcher inside the ambulance. Bella turned. Dominic was lying flat, a heavy IV of saline dripping into his arm, his right leg heavily bandaged and elevated. He was pale, but the bleeding had stopped. He managed a weak, exhausted smirk. "I gotta admit, for a civilian, you got a hell of a swing. You put that Kozlov goon to sleep faster than Propofol." Bella managed a faint, tired smile, taking a sip of the bitter coffee. "I used to play softball in high school, Dominic. Keep your leg elevated. If you pop those sutures before Dr. Sterling's replacement gets here, I'm going to use that lug wrench on you." Dominic chuckled, though it turned into a wince. "Yes, ma'am." A sudden shift in the atmosphere pulled Bella's attention toward the main courtyard. The chaotic chatter of the cleanup crew fell completely silent. The men parted like the Red Sea, lowering their weapons and bowing their heads in unquestioning reverence. Silas was walking out of the ruined front doors of the mansion. He had refused any medical attention until every single one of his men had been triaged and secured. He looked like a king who had just dragged his empire back from the very edge of hell. His black t-shirt was torn and covered in soot. The sling holding his left arm was completely shredded, exposing the stark white bandages beneath. But he walked with a terrifying, predatory grace. Two massive enforcers were dragging a man behind him. It was Vincente Rossi. The traitorous underboss was thrown roughly onto the cracked marble of the courtyard, falling to his knees amidst the debris of the shattered front gates. Bella watched from the ambulance, her breath catching in her throat. She had seen Silas the survivor, and she had seen Silas the protector. Now, she was looking at Silas the executioner. Silas stepped up to the kneeling man. Vincente was weeping, his tailored suit torn, his hands bound with heavy zip ties. "Boss, please," Vincente choked out, blood dripping from his nose. "They had my daughter. The Russians had Chloe. I didn't have a choice. You know I love this family." Silas didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The quiet, lethal calm of his tone carried across the freezing morning air, chilling Bella to the bone. "You loved the power, Vincente," Silas murmured, looking down at his former friend with eyes devoid of any human mercy. "If you had come to me, we would have burned the Kozlov Bratva to the ground to get your daughter back. We would have waged a war that would have made the streets run red for her. But you didn't. You made a deal with the wolves, and you brought them to my door. Silas, I beg you." "Take him to the warehouse in Red Hook," Silas interrupted, turning his back on the weeping man. He looked at the two enforcers. "Get out of him everything the Russians told him. Then, make sure he doesn't see tomorrow." "Yes, boss," the men replied in unison, dragging the screaming underboss away toward a waiting SUV. Silas watched them leave, his jaw tight, before turning his gaze across the courtyard, his eyes locked onto Bella, sitting on the ambulance bumper. Instantly, the terrifying absolute zero of his expression melted. The Mafia Don vanished, leaving only the man she had pulled from the snow. He walked slowly toward her, his boots crunching over shattered glass and spent brass casings. As he passed his men, Bella noticed something incredible. The syndicate guards didn't just avert their eyes out of respect for Silas. As they looked up, they looked at her. They nodded silently. Some tapped their hands over their hearts. The deference wasn't just for their boss anymore. It was for the woman who had held the line in the garage when the walls fell. Silas stopped right in front of her. Up close, The toll of the night was etched deeply into the sharp lines of his face. He looked down at the blood staining her clothes. It wasn't his blood this time. "You didn't run," Silas said quietly, his deep baritone rough with smoke and exhaustion. "I gave you an armored car and a clear exit, Bella. You could have disappeared." Bella looked up into those piercing, steel-grey eyes. The fear that had gripped her in the cabin was entirely gone. In its place was an intense, undeniable understanding of the man standing before her. "I told you," Bella replied, her voice steady. "I know how to deal with trauma, Silas. I just usually don't cause it with a mechanic's tool." A faint, genuine smile broke across Silas's battered face. It completely transformed his features, stripping away the harshness and making him look startlingly handsome in the pale dawn light. He reached out with his right hand, gently cupping her jaw. His thumb brushed a streak of soot from her cheekbone. His touch was incredibly warm, a stark contrast to the freezing ocean wind whipping around them. "I told you that you were my responsibility, Bella. I told you that you were a civilian under my protection," Silas murmured, his voice dropping to a low, intimate register meant only for her. "But I was wrong." Bella swallowed hard, her heart pounding against her ribs for an entirely different reason now. "What am I, then?" Silas looked over his shoulder at the wreckage of his $60 million fortress, then back at the trauma nurse from upstate New York who had brought a rogue faction of the Mafia to its knees with her sheer, stubborn will to protect life. "You aren't a captive," Silas said, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "And you aren't just a guest in a gilded cage. Look at them, Bella." He gestured slightly toward the perimeter guards. "My men look at you, and they don't see a helpless civilian anymore. They see the woman who stood over my bleeding underboss and held the line against the Kozlovs. They see a queen." He reached into the pocket of his ruined tactical pants and pulled out a heavy object. He took Bella's trembling hand and gently placed it into her palm, closing her fingers over it. Bella looked down. It was the heavy Patek Philippe Nautilus watch. The sapphire crystal was still cracked from the night he had collapsed on her porch, the mechanical dials forever frozen at 11:42 p.m., the exact moment he had fallen against her cabin door. It was the symbol of his old life ending and their collision beginning. "I can't offer you a quiet life, Bella. I can't offer you peace," Silas said, stepping closer, his imposing presence entirely enveloping her, blocking out the wind, the noise, and the destruction. "The blizzard is always going to be howling outside our door. There will always be wolves in the tree line." He leaned in, his forehead resting gently against hers, his breath warm against her skin. "But if you stay," Silas whispered fiercely, "if you choose this, I swear to God, Bella, you will never be cold again." Bella looked at the broken watch in her hand. She thought of her isolated, lonely cabin in the Adirondacks. She thought of the deafening silence she had used as a shield against the world. She didn't want the quiet anymore. She wanted the fire. She wanted the storm. She wanted him. "Then you had better buy me a new Loro Piana sweater," Bella whispered, a fierce smile touching her lips. Before Silas could register the joke, Bella dropped the coffee cup, grabbed him by the collar of his ruined black shirt, and pulled him down, crashing her lips against his. Silas groaned, his right arm wrapping tightly around her waist, lifting her slightly off the bumper as he kissed her back with a desperate, all-consuming heat that rivaled the fires burning in the courtyard. The kiss was a vow, written in gunpowder, survival, and absolute loyalty. A sudden, roaring cheer erupted across the devastated lawn. Dominic was pounding his fist against the side of the ambulance, grinning from ear to ear, while the surviving men of the Romano Syndicate raised their weapons to the pale dawn sky, their voices echoing over the crashing waves of the Atlantic, fiercely welcoming their new queen. What a wild, heart-stopping ride. From a freezing, isolated cabin in the Adirondacks to a sprawling, blood-soaked estate in Southampton, Bella and Silas's story proves that sometimes the most dangerous storms don't happen in the weather. They happen in our hearts. Bella went from a reclusive trauma nurse to the undisputed queen of the Romano Syndicate, trading her peaceful life for an empire built on loyalty, survival, and an undeniable, burning romance. If you loved this intense, twist-filled Mafia romance drama, please hit that like button to support the channel. It helps us bring you more thrilling, cinematic stories just like this one. Don't forget to share this video with your fellow romance and drama lovers, and subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on our next epic storytelling adventure. Let us know in the comments, would you have opened the door for Silas? See you in the next video.